Dog won't leave park bench. Then rescuers realize why it's been waiting. The small town of Brookfield was the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. Neighbors knew each other's names, children played in tree-lined streets, and the local park, Riverstone Park, was the heart of the community. It was a sprawling green space with winding paths, a bubbling fountain, and clusters of benches where people would gather to chat, read, or simply enjoy the tranquility. One particular bench, tucked under the shade of a large oak tree, had recently become the center of a peculiar mystery. For days, a dog, a golden doodle with a fluffy, cream-colored coat and soulful brown eyes, had taken up residence there. The dog, later identified as Mila by a weathered leather tag on her collar, seemed unwilling to leave. At first, people assumed Mila was just another stray, though her well-groomed coat and healthy weight suggested she had a home. She would sit at the bench from sunrise to sunset, her posture straight and her gaze fixed on the path ahead. Occasionally, she would lie down, resting her head on her paws, but she never wandered far. Even at night, when the park emptied, Mila stayed close to her bench, a quiet sentinel in the stillness. Word of the dog spread quickly through Brookfield. Mila's unwavering vigil touched the hearts of those who frequented the park. Some brought her food and water, leaving bowls by the bench. A local florist left a small blanket on one particularly chilly evening, and an elderly man, a regular at the park, would sit beside her, offering quiet companionship. "Poor thing," Mrs. Langley, a retired teacher, remarked to her friend one morning. "She must be waiting for someone." "Do you think she's lost?" her friend Harriet asked, watching as Mila lifted her head to look down the path at the sound of a distant jogger. "Perhaps," Mrs. Langley replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "Or maybe she was left behind." Mila's behavior puzzled everyone. Unlike most dogs, she didn't chase squirrels, sniff at trees, or beg for attention. She didn't bark or whimper, and when approached, she would simply look up with her deep, mournful eyes as though trying to communicate something no one could quite understand. It was as if Mila was waiting for someone or something only she knew. Local animal control officers were called to check on Mila, concerned she might be lost or injured. But when they arrived, Mila refused to leave the bench. When one officer gently looped a leash around her collar, Mila resisted, digging her paws into the ground and whimpering softly. Eventually, they decided to leave her be, noting that she wasn't in immediate danger and appeared to be well cared for by the community. Despite their best efforts, no one could determine where Mila had come from. Her leather collar bore her name, but no contact information, and no one in Brookfield recognized her. Flyers were posted around town, social media posts circulated, and the local vet was notified, but no one came forward to claim her. As the days turned into weeks, Mila's presence at the bench became a fixture of the park. Children would stop to pet her on their way home from school, their laughter briefly lifting the somber air that surrounded her. Joggers and dog walkers would pause to check on her, offering kind words and encouragement. "You're such a good girl, Mila," one woman said softly, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. Mila leaned into the touch briefly before returning her gaze to the path. Mila's silent vigil stirred something in the hearts of those who met her. There was a palpable sense of longing in her demeanor, a quiet resilience that seemed to mirror the struggles of those who passed by. For some, Mila became a symbol of hope and unwavering loyalty. One afternoon, a young journalist named Clara visited the park, intrigued by the story she'd heard about Mila. Clara had moved to Brookfield a few months prior and worked for the town's modest newspaper, the Brookfield Gazette. Armed with her notebook and camera, she approached the bench cautiously, not wanting to startle the dog. "Hi, Mila," she said softly, crouching a few feet away. Mila turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Clara's with a quiet intensity. Clara snapped a few photos capturing the golden doodle framed by the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak tree's branches. She noticed the small pile of items left by well-wishers: a blanket, a couple of bowls, and even a chew toy someone had thoughtfully brought. Mila seemed uninterested in these offerings, her focus never straying far from the path. "What are you waiting for?" Clara murmured, more to herself than the dog. That evening, Clara wrote an article about Mila for the Gazette. She described the dog's mysterious behavior, her apparent loyalty, and the community's efforts to care for her. The piece, titled "The Dog Who Waits," quickly gained attention, with readers from Brookfield and beyond sharing their own theories and offering assistance. Some speculated that Mila's owner had passed away, leaving her to wait for someone who would never return. Others wondered if she had been abandoned at the park, left with no choice but to stay where she had last seen her family. A few suggested that perhaps Mila was guarding something near the bench, a hidden clue to her past. Clara, moved by the outpouring of support, decided to dig deeper into Mila's story. She began visiting the park daily, spending hours observing the dog and speaking to those who had interacted with her. Mila, while wary of new people, seemed to accept Clara's presence, even allowing the journalist to sit on the bench beside her as she worked. Days turned into weeks, and Mila's mystery only deepened. But Clara was determined to uncover the truth, unaware that the answer would be far more extraordinary than anything she or the townspeople could have imagined. As the days passed, Mila's unwavering presence at the park bench continued to stir curiosity and compassion throughout Brookfield. Clara had now made it a personal mission to unravel the mystery surrounding the Golden Doodle's vigil. Armed with her notepad and camera, she spent every morning and evening at Riverstone Park, sitting near Mila and documenting the dog's behavior. Mila's routine was predictable, almost ritualistic. She would sit upright on the bench for hours, her brown eyes scanning the path as though she were waiting for someone to appear. Occasionally, she would sniff the air or perk up her ears at the sound of footsteps in the distance, only to settle back down when the sound faded. Clara noticed that Mila often looked toward the fountain near the center of the park, her gaze lingering there before returning to the path. Intrigued, Clara began interviewing people who had interacted with Mila. "She's been here for weeks," said Mrs. Langley, one of the park's regulars. "Always watching, always waiting. It's heartbreaking, really. I've tried coaxing her to come home with me, but she refuses to leave." "Do you think she's waiting for her owner?" Clara asked. Mrs. Langley nodded. "That's the only explanation I can think of. Poor thing must have been abandoned." Others had different theories. A young man who jogged through the park every morning told Clara he believed Mila might have been left behind intentionally. "Sometimes people move and can't take their pets with them," he said, shaking his head in frustration. "It's cruel, but it happens." Clara wasn't convinced. Mila didn't behave like a dog who had been abandoned. Her vigilance suggested a purpose, a deep-rooted hope that the person she was waiting for would return. Clara decided to dig deeper, starting with the one tangible clue she had: Mila's leather collar. Clara managed to convince the local animal control officer, Sam, to help her track down any information about Mila. Together, they carefully inspected the worn leather collar around the golden doodle's neck. The name Mila was etched into a small brass plate, but there was no phone number or address. "Do you think it's possible to trace the collar?" Clara asked as Sam examined it. "It's a long shot," Sam replied, scratching his head, "but I can try reaching out to local pet stores and online forums to see if anyone recognizes the brand or style." While Sam worked on the collar, Clara decided to canvass nearby neighborhoods. She went door to door, showing residents a photo of Mila and asking if they recognized the dog. Some had seen her at the park, but no one knew where she had come from. "I've lived here for over a decade, and I've never seen that dog before," one elderly man told her. "But she's a beauty, isn't she? Hope you figure out where she belongs." Despite hours of effort, Clara found herself at a dead end. Frustrated but undeterred, she returned to the park, where Mila was resting with her head on her paws. The sight tugged at Clara's heart. She sat down on the bench beside the dog and gently stroked her soft, curly fur. "We'll figure this out, Mila," Clara said softly. "I promise." Mila lifted her head and leaned into Clara's touch, letting out a quiet sigh. It was the first time Mila had shown any real connection to someone, and it gave Clara a renewed sense of determination. A few days later, Sam called Clara with news. "I think I might have something," he said. "One of the pet stores I contacted recognized the collar. It's a custom design from a shop in Pinewood, the next town over." Clara's heart raced. "That's amazing. Do they keep records of their customers?" "They do, but it's not digital," Sam explained. "You'll need to visit in person." The next morning, Clara drove to Pinewood and found the pet shop, a quaint little store with shelves lined with handmade collars, leashes, and toys. The shop owner, a kind-faced woman named Judy, greeted her warmly. "I hear you've got a mystery dog," Judy said with a smile as Clara showed her a photo of Mila. "Let me check my records." Judy disappeared into the back room and returned a few minutes later with a leather-bound ledger. "Here we go," she said, flipping through the pages. "This collar design was purchased about 2 years ago by someone named Evelyn Harris. Does that name ring a bell?" Clara shook her head. "Not yet, but it's a start. Do you have any contact information for her?" Judy nodded and handed Clara a slip of paper with an address and phone number. "I hope you find her," she said. "That dog looks like she's been through a lot." Clara thanked Judy and left the shop, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She decided to visit the address first, hoping it would lead her to Mila's owner. The address led Clara to a modest white house on the outskirts of Pinewood. The yard was overgrown, and the windows were shuttered, giving the place an air of abandonment. Clara knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She peered through a window and saw empty rooms, confirming that the house had been vacated. Undeterred, Clara called the phone number Judy had given her. After several rings, a voicemail picked up. "Hello, this is Evelyn Harris. I can't come to the phone right now, but please leave a message." Clara left a detailed message explaining who she was, how she had found Mila, and her desire to reunite the dog with her owner. She hung up and returned to Brookfield, hoping Evelyn would call back. Days passed with no response. Clara began to wonder if Evelyn had moved far away or if something had happened to prevent her from answering. The uncertainty weighed heavily on her, but she refused to give up. Meanwhile, Mila's vigil continued. Despite Clara's efforts to coax her away from the bench, the golden doodle remained steadfast, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "What are you waiting for, Mila?" Clara whispered one evening, watching as the dog's eyes glimmered in the fading light. Little did Clara know the answer was closer than she imagined, and it would change everything. Clara's determination to solve the mystery surrounding Mila grew stronger with each passing day. The golden doodle's unwavering vigil at the park bench haunted her, filling her with both admiration and sadness. Who or what could be so important that Mila refused to leave, even when comfort, food, and warmth were offered? Clara continued to document her journey, writing updates in the Brookfield Gazette, and readers eagerly followed her progress. One morning, just as Clara was about to head to Riverstone Park, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and saw a number she didn't recognize. "Hello, this is Clara," she answered. "Hi, Clara. This is Evelyn Harris. You left a message about Mila." The voice on the other end was soft, tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. Clara's heart raced. "Evelyn, thank you for calling. I've been trying to figure out Mila's story. She's been staying at a park bench in Brookfield for weeks, and no one knows why. I traced her collar back to you. Do you know her?" There was a long pause, followed by a trembling sigh. "Yes, I know Mila. She was my husband's dog." Clara's grip on the phone tightened. "Was? My husband, Thomas, passed away a few months ago," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "Mila was his constant companion. They did everything together, walked, played, even worked in the garden. After he died, she was devastated. I tried to comfort her, but she wasn't the same." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Evelyn, but how did Mila end up at Riverstone Park?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "Thomas used to take her there every weekend. It was their special place. I think maybe she ran away to look for him. I've been searching for her ever since she disappeared 2 weeks ago." Clara's mind raced as she processed Evelyn's words. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Mila wasn't just waiting. She was grieving, clinging to the last place where she had been happy with her beloved owner. "Evelyn, I think Mila is still waiting for Thomas," Clara said gently. "She's been sitting at the same bench every day, looking down the path as if she expects him to come back." Evelyn let out a choked sob. "That sounds like her. She was so loyal to him. I don't know how to make her understand that he's gone." "Maybe you could come to the park," Clara suggested. "If Mila sees you, it might help her find closure." There was a moment of silence before Evelyn replied, "Yes, I'll come. I owe it to her and to Thomas." That afternoon, Clara waited anxiously at Riverstone Park with Mila. The golden doodle was as steadfast as ever, her eyes scanning the path for someone who wouldn't return. Clara had told Mila's story so many times in her articles, but now, seeing the dog's silent hope up close, the weight of it was almost too much to bear. Evelyn arrived just after 3 p.m., stepping out of a weathered sedan with tentative steps. She was a petite woman in her early 60s, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun. Her eyes, red-rimmed with grief, widened as she caught sight of Mila. "Mila!" Evelyn called, her voice trembling. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her name. She turned her head slowly, as if unsure whether to believe what she was hearing. Then recognition flashed in her eyes, and Mila bolted toward Evelyn with a burst of energy Clara hadn't seen before. "Mila, my sweet girl!" Evelyn cried, dropping to her knees as the golden doodle reached her. Mila's tail wagged furiously as she pressed herself against Evelyn, nuzzling her face and letting out soft, joyful whines. Evelyn wrapped her arms around the dog, tears streaming down her face. Clara stood back, her own eyes welling with tears at the emotional reunion. She had spent weeks wondering what or who Mila was waiting for, and now the answer was right in front of her. It wasn't just Evelyn Mila needed, it was the connection to Thomas, the man she had loved so deeply. As Evelyn and Mila sat together on the bench, Evelyn began to speak. "Thomas and I used to bring her here every Saturday," she explained, her voice soft but steady. "We'd sit on this very bench, watch the fountain, and share a sandwich. Mila loved it. It was her favorite time of the week." Mila rested her head on Evelyn's lap, her brown eyes gazing up with a mix of love and longing. It was as though she finally understood that she wasn't alone in her grief. "I think she's been waiting for a sign," Clara said, sitting down beside them. "Something to tell her that it's okay to move on." Evelyn nodded, stroking Mila's fur. "She's always been so loyal. Even now, she's still holding on to him." Over the next few days, Evelyn and Mila began visiting the park together, retracing the steps that Mila had once taken with Thomas. Each visit seemed to bring Mila a little more peace, her tail wagging more frequently and her eyes losing some of their sadness. Clara continued to document their journey, sharing updates in the Gazette. The community, touched by the story, rallied around Evelyn and Mila. People brought treats for the dog, left flowers on the bench in honor of Thomas, and stopped to offer kind words to Evelyn. One afternoon, Clara found Evelyn sitting on the bench, Mila lying contentedly at her feet. Evelyn was holding a small framed photo of Thomas, her fingers tracing the edges of the picture. "I think Mila is starting to heal," Evelyn said, her voice tinged with both sorrow and hope. "She'll never forget him, but she knows she's not alone anymore." Clara smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Mila's story had begun with heartbreak, but it had brought people together in ways none of them could have expected. Months later, Riverstone Park looked much the same as it always had, but something had shifted. Mila no longer sat at the bench all day, her vigil complete. Instead, she could often be seen walking alongside Evelyn, exploring the park with a spring in her step. Clara, now a regular visitor, would join them occasionally, sharing stories and laughter as they walked the paths. The bench under the oak tree remained a special place, a symbol of love, loss, and the enduring bond between humans and their animals. For Mila, the park was no longer a place of waiting. It was a place of memories, a bridge between the past and the present. And for Evelyn, it was a reminder that even in the face of grief, love could endure, and healing was always possible. As Clara watched Evelyn and Mila walk off into the sunset one evening, she knew that their story had found its happy ending. Mila's wait was over, but her journey of love and loyalty would continue, inspiring everyone who had been touched by her unwavering heart.